Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this very special How To event. My name is Matt D'Ancona. I'm an editor and partner at Tortoise Media, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us at this very special event with Richard Haass. You know, one of my favorite jokes in contemporary fiction or recent fiction is the madly specific essay title that the historian Jim Dixon in Kingsley Amos's novel Lucky Jim gives to his essay, which is the economic influence of the developments in shipbuilding techniques 1450 to 1485, which is, I think, about as specific as you can get. So it's a tonic to have at the absolute opposite end of the thematic spectrum, Richard Haass's latest 14th and, in my view, wonderful book, The World, A Brief Introduction, which covers, I think, just about everything. And I recommend it to you highly. And we're very honoured to have Richard with us today. I mean, who better to supply that introduction? He has been at the heart of foreign policy for very many years and recognised as one of the most important voices in the world in that sphere. As president of the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003, an advisor to President Bush Sr. from 1989 to 93, and a member of the National Security Council. He served as director of the State Department's policy planning staff under the second President Bush, amongst many other distinctions, which would take up the whole hour to list. So Richard, I'm going to come to you first, and I hope in the course of this that everyone here will add their questions and thoughts into the chat so that we can come to you in due course and offer Richard the chance to offer his insights into your ideas and your reflections. But Richard, I mean, here is this book. It's it takes as its subject the totality. What inspired you, after having written many books of distinction about foreign affairs, to write this one?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Good afternoon, as we would say here. It is very different than anything I've written. I'd say all my previous books were for people who had already opted into what you might call the foreign policy or international relations conversation, be it as journalists, as academics, as practitioners, as interested citizens. What led me to write this was a conclusion that that's all fine, but it's simply not enough. We're about to go to the elections, have elections in this country in just over 2 months. We're going to be voting for the person whoever wins is going to have extraordinary power and influence. Yet so few Americans are going to be in a position to cast an informed vote when it comes to what he might do in the realm of foreign policy, even though it will have tremendous implications, not just for others, but for ourselves. And so I decided that it was important to try to write a book that would address that. The lack of general understanding and knowledge, the lack of an appreciation of why the world matters, how it works, how what happens in the world affects us, how what we do in turn affects the world. And what specifically led to it, Matt, was an encounter I had with this young man who was about to finish up at Stanford in computer sciences. Here's one of the great universities in the world. And he was going to graduate, and I don't mean to be super critical, I'll just be straight, essentially illiterate about the world he was going to enter, hadn't studied any meaningful history or economics or political science, and was essentially unprepared for the world that was going to be the backdrop to his life. So again, my immodest, but I think important goal here was to try to narrow the gap between what individuals know about the world and what they actually need to know about the world.
And now, one of many phrases that leaps out of the pages of the book is global literacy. First of all, what is that? And why do you think it's in decline?
To me, global literacy is the possession of a foundational understanding of the world about why it matters, how it operates. It doesn't mean you have to be able to go toe to toe with Henry Kissinger. It simply means that you have a basic understanding of the forces that are at work and ways in which the world can affect your life, whether it's now pandemics or climate change. We've seen the stuff of history of great powers and conflict, and in turn, some of the basic considerations of foreign policy. The reason it's important to mention is that you can now graduate from virtually any university in the world, particularly in this country, the United States, and not get it. The courses are offered, but in most cases are not required. What worries me is if you don't get it in university, then when will you get it? You certainly don't get it here on the nightly news programs. You could get it on the internet. The problem is there's so much else that's misinformation and junk, and there's no one basically helping you navigate it. Say, read this, but ignore, but ignore that. And so there's again too many people could come of age. Again, without this requisite knowledge. And I worry about that. How are you meant to be an informed citizen? How are you meant to hold public officials to account? When someone says, support this, oppose that, how are you to know what's in your own self-interest? And again, this is my effort to empower people to be in a stronger position to look after their own interests.
So it's the key tools of citizenship. So let's start where we are now in late August 2020. Now, I know the book went to press well before the pandemic struck in with the ferocity that it has, but to do you justice, on page 210, you do say, at the same time, a large-scale global epidemic, a pandemic, cannot be discounted, and the global economy could suffer a major blow. Spot on. Before we move on to the other themes in the book, can you give us a sort of, sit rep on how the international community, if indeed the international community has cohered enough to deserve a report card? How's it done?
Well, as you suggest in your question, I'm not sure the phrase international community should be used. I see that as aspirational rather than actual. I'd love there to be an international community, and that would suggest that countries and others thought similarly and were prepared to act in tandem. I simply don't think it exists. In most cases, we have a disagreement or inaction or opposing actions. I mean, look at this. What so strikes me is here you have one of the clear manifestations of globalization, the spread of this virus around the world. What began in Wuhan obviously didn't stay there. And look at the variation in impact. And what's so interesting is the variation does not correlate to the nature of the system. We have democracies doing well, democracies doing terribly. We have authoritarian systems doing well, authoritarian systems doing terribly. So it all speaks to the leadership, to the willingness to take certain steps, to message consistently and so forth. So the world has done unevenly, for the most part, poorly. And what worries me going forward is I still don't see the prerequisites in place either for dealing with the next phases of this challenge. For example, if a vaccine were to emerge, what would be the mechanisms for distribution, production, and so forth? For payment, I don't see that. And I don't see us taking the steps to improve the machinery that is meant to deal with pandemics, such as the World Health Organization. Hasn't helped that the United States withdrew, but even beyond that, it's flawed. So again, I wish there were an international community for dealing with this or future pandemics. And by the way, there will be future pandemics. This one's COVID-19. One day you and I will have a conversation about COVID-24 or COVID-28 or what have you. But the world at the moment still hasn't narrowed the gap between where it is and where it needs to be.
So we've established that the performance has not been inspiring, to say the least. I want to return to COVID, of course, but I also want to get into some of the themes in the book that actually I think will lead us back to it. Again, a very important intellectual distinction in your book is between global governance and global government. Now, again, can you explain what the difference is and why you're in favour of one rather than the other?
Yeah, I'll try to speak clearly because the two are easily confused. My American accent won't help here. Global government, MENT, does not exist and will not exist. That suggests there would be a single unitary actor and everybody would be subordinate to it. The way that national governments work and the states or provinces all essentially feed into that. That to me is a red herring. It's a non-starter. It's not going to happen. Global governance, ANCE, however, in some ways it harkens back to your previous question about international community. Global governance is the measure of the willingness and ability for governments and others to come together to meet common challenges. The challenges could be North Korean proliferation, Iranian would-be proliferation or aggression, what Russia's doing in Ukraine or anywhere else. Could be climate change, could be dealing with global public health, could be setting the rules for cyberspace. So global governance is above all the willingness and ability of governments and others to come together to set the rules, to build institutions, to discipline those who act against the rules, to essentially create or move in the direction of international community to essentially say, this is how the world's going to work in this domain. And to the extent that happens, then we have a degree of global governance.
So after the Second World War, as you just discussed in the book, a whole series of institutions and organizations and alliances were established in order to produce the kind of global arrangements that you're describing. Again, though, we have to ask how are we doing? I mean, one start at the top. Let's look at the United Nations, a Security Council that's often gridlocked. A self-proclaimed responsibility to intervene where necessary, the R2P, the famous R2P doctrine. These are not necessarily going well, are they? And I suppose my question is, what are the forces that are going to drive them into self-healing and self-improvement?
Well, with classic continental understatement, you say these forces, these are not doing terribly well. They're not. And the reason is that governments disagree and national interests lead them as they see them in different directions. The last time the world really came together to deal with the classic problem of war and peace on a large scale was probably 30 years ago when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. It violated the most basic rule of international relations. You shouldn't change borders with the use of force. Saddam Hussein tried to do that when he incorporated Kuwait, and the world came together and pushed back. That was an example of, there was an international community. The UN was at the center of it with American leadership, but that was the exception. And if one looks at the last 30 years, what stands out so much more is when the UN has basically stood on the sidelines, including, by the way, in the current pandemic. It's been missing in action. You mentioned the responsibility to protect action, which was passed in 2005. Well, over the last 25 years, it's been marked by 15 years, sorry, it hasn't really been implemented. And right now, you probably couldn't get a vote to pass it in the UN General Assembly. The Chinese, the Russians, and others see it as a threat to their own sovereignty. So the UN is only as good or as bad as its component, as its constituent members are prepared to allow it to be. And at the moment, they're not prepared to allow it to be significant.
I suppose there are a series of forces operating on that. I mean, one is the aftermath of 9/11, the wars that America got embroiled on and the huge cost in blood and treasure. The other is, the other two, I suppose, are Putin's decision to turn Russia almost into a prankster nation, a mischief maker. And then the third, I suppose, is the is the rise of China, with all that entails. Okay. Now, again, how does one, from this very disparate and disaggregated landscape, how do you bring people together in a way that is never going to be wholly harmonious, but might actually achieve some goals?
Look, the short answer is in most cases you won't be able to, and that's probably the wrong framing. The goal, I would think, of a serious country's foreign policy cannot be at this stage in history to make the United Nations critically relevant. There simply won't be the degree of commonality of interest or policy. Instead, I think one needs to embrace multilateralism. There's no better alternative to collective endeavor, but it has to be narrower, has to be more selective. So you work with the like-minded. You put together what I once described as coalitions of the willing, or coalitions of the willing and able and relevant. So you might not get everybody on board to deal with climate change, but you may be able to get many of the major economies on board, and that might deal with 75% of the challenge. Or you get the most involved countries to deal with an Iran nuclear issue, or with a North Korea. Maybe the United States, if it rediscovers the importance of allies, would work with the European allies and others in coming up with a common policy to regulate the internet and cyberspace. So I think that's the way to think about it. The alternative to the UN is not unilateralism. It's certainly not isolationism. I think it's a kind of variable, like in Europe, you used to talk about variable geometry inside of the EU. I think we need to think about these designer multilateral groupings. It might be different in each. And by the way, in some cases, it won't just be governments. If you were going to bring together the most important actors in the world today to deal with the pandemic, you would want to have the Gates Foundation. You would maybe want to have some of the big pharmaceutical companies. If you were going to regulate the digital domain, you would want to have Facebook and Twitter, Apple and Google and others. So I think we have to be creative about who's in the room. And I think we have to understand that for each challenge that's out there, we might need to bring together a different cast of characters.
So you're fairly pessimistic on where we're at the moment on climate change. What you've just said perhaps hints at a way forward, which would be one that of course, relied to a great extent on national legislation and international cooperation and multilateralism, but would also draw in, expertise and knowledge and collaboration from the big corporations involved. Again, how do we get culturally from where we're at to that slightly more promising scenario?
It's a good question. I think probably on the basis that it's not perfect, but it's possible. And I think you have to explain it. Like everything else in public policy, I think people in power often underestimate the importance of explaining and educating. Coming back to where we began the conversation, most people don't get up in the morning with the requisite or ideal background. And I think the importance of using, whether it's 10 Downing Street or the Oval Office, as a little bit of a classroom. The American President Franklin Roosevelt, the fireside chats, which gradually brought the United States closer to involvement in the run-up to World War II, is to me something of a model that leaders have to educate in order to bring along a population. So I think you would need to do that. So if I were going to advise an American president here, I would say, look, the Paris Agreement, even if everybody were in it, including the United States, even if everybody lived up to it, is still woefully inadequate. So let's think about something better. Maybe we need trade agreements that put tariffs on countries that don't meet certain environmental standards when they manufacture and export their products. Maybe we work together with narrower groupings. Maybe we set up zones where we share certain technologies in the same way that when drugs come along that are very helpful and we make them widely available, why wouldn't we do that with certain green technologies? But I think we need to think much more pragmatically, almost bottom up. Most people think about all these challenges and they think we've got to come up with, whether it's a UN General Assembly model, it's a top-down model. universal involvement, some rules for everybody. And I think increasingly we've got to think of bottom-up, much more selective involvement, much more designer-like. And I think this just needs explaining.
All of which is true. The roadblock to that, of course, is the rise of populist politics, which has, I suppose, as one of its defining characteristics, the idea that, or the claim, spurious claim, that there are simple solutions to complex problems. So what you have in America is a president who simply refuses to listen to scientific advice. In the UK, you have a government that believes that the answer to dinghies full of refugees arriving across the English Channel is to militarize the issue and to threaten them with the Royal Navy, neither of which is actually a solution. And one of the great ironies of populism is that it's not very good at doing stuff. It's not very good at getting stuff done. However, that is the sort of political cultural setting. I just wonder whether you see a scintilla of optimism in the fact that the pandemic has demonstrated this. It's sort of tested that thesis to destruction. You know, you
100%. And no, and I think you raise a really important point. Populism's better at criticizing as an outsider than it is at delivering or performing as an insider. Now, if insiders perform badly, populists will win. In my country, someone like Donald Trump became president in the aftermath of things like the 2007-8 financial crisis, the overreach in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the environment was ripe for an outsider. We've seen it in other countries as well. But sooner or later, then the populist becomes the insider. And he or she has got to perform, or sooner or later, as we've seen historically around the world in places like Argentina and elsewhere, they're going to be tossed out. And one of the interesting things of the coronavirus is, going back to something we were talking about a few minutes ago, if you have this really uneven handling or success or competence level at dealing with it, some of the governments that are run by populists may not be around forever. You know, we'll see how long Mr. Bolsonaro is around. We'll see what happens in the United States this November. And other places we'll see competence rewarded, and populists won't be able to make much traction. I doubt a populist would do wildly well in New Zealand right now, because you've got a government there that's governed with considerable competence. So that, but at times populists will win. Essentially, again, when the establishment doesn't deliver, and one just has to hope they get tossed out before they do too much damage.
So, looking at a sort of very, basic issue in the book, one of warfare, you point out that there haven't been many interstate wars in recent decades. First of all, what prevents that happening, and can we look upon the relative infrequency of such wars between nations now as a pattern we can rely upon?
Well, there's a big debate about that. I'm on the side, as you can sense from my general default option, I don't take it as a given that wars are a thing of the past. For example, right now, I'm very worried about the possibility of a US-Chinese confrontation beginning in the South China Sea or over something like Taiwan. I don't rule out the possibility of something with Russia if and when Mr. Putin probes elsewhere. But all things being equal, I do think wars between states as opposed to within them have become less common, in part because of nuclear weapons. That among the major powers, that's been a big dampener, the risk of escalation. And also, wars can be so destructive, it's in many cases, there's not so much a winner as there are two losers. And one could use other tools in order to promote your interests or further your foreign policy objectives. But wars can happen still because of miscalculation or because of ambition. We just had a skirmish between India and China. So I just think it's foolhardy to think that war between countries is somehow on the quote unquote ash heap of history. And God knows, you don't even need to make the argument that wars within countries are all too commonplace.
When you look at the kind of bipolarity of the world between China and America, and particularly its very heavy involvement with the world of technology and AI and so on, what do you think the future holds? Because it does seem to me that there are some people within the Trump administration who still cling to the kind of Bannonite view that there is going to be at some point a hot war with China. And I myself don't see that as an inevitability, but I'm interested in what you think the likely sequence might be.
I don't think it's an inevitability. Indeed, Matt, I don't think anything's an inevitability. The more I study history, the more I am persuaded that what happens is not baked into the cake. It's because of decisions made by men and women in power, sometimes wise, all too often not. So I can't sit here and rule out the possibility of a US-Chinese incident or confrontation that escalates. Of course that could happen, and alas, we're closer to it today than we were 3 or 6 months ago. But again, it's not inevitable. I'd also say it's not limited to Steve Bannon. It's not limited just to the Trumpites. I think if there's a President Biden, you will see a very tough American policy towards China. And I think it's a real question whether the two governments can manage a more combative relationship without it deteriorating into armed interaction, and whether they can compete economically, whether they can disagree geopolitically, and still preserve the possibility of cooperating, say, on climate change or on North Korea or on in Afghanistan. And that'll be a real challenge to American and Chinese statecraft. And at the moment, it's not clear to me that either side is up to that challenge.
You talk in the book very interestingly about the nature of what in a modern context a sovereign state can mean. And I think that question has become more live since the pandemic, because a lot of people are now talking about issues of economic resilience, of less dependence upon just-in-time supply lines, stockpiling just in case. And so there is a turning inward in some places. So can you paint a picture for us of what sovereignty it means in an interdependent world, to take the paradox?
Yeah, it's a great question. You're exactly right the way you framed it. I think in these pendulums swing, and 10 years ago, all the effort was in the name of efficiency, reduce costs, let's not have inventories. It doesn't matter if we only have one overseas source of supply. If it's the cheapest, then it's good enough. Well, now we've seen, and whether the problem is COVID, or the problem is an earthquake, or a storm, or a nuclear accident, or a civil war, we can't afford to be so dependent upon supply chains. So I think you're going to see move towards diversification. I think you're going to see mandated domestic stockpiling. I think you're probably going to see mandated domestic production requirements around the world. And the question is, can this all be orchestrated in a way that doesn't simply become a cover for protectionism that really hurts world trade? So I think there's that. I think also, I thought you were going somewhere else. So let me take it somewhere else. Here we are, we live in a sovereign world. We don't want to see what Saddam Hussein did to Kuwait, what Russia did to Ukraine. We don't want to see sovereignty violated. But, and it's a big but, we've also seen that when a virus breaks out in China, it can have implications for all of us. Americans learned on 9/11 when terrorists were trained in Afghanistan, hiding behind Afghan sovereignty, 3,000 people died in an afternoon in the United States. Climate change, everybody pays a price for what others are doing. So what we've got to figure out a way is, how do we preserve the good part of sovereignty? The idea that countries don't constantly invade one another, don't interfere in their electoral politics and so forth, like the way the Russians are. At the same time, people understand that sovereignty doesn't give you the right to house things within your borders that could be detrimental to others, whether it's terrorists or could do certain things, say with coal, or not have a serious ability to monitor and deal with the outbreak of infectious disease. So I think it sounds academic, but I actually think a fundamental question for living in a global world like this one, where all sorts of things move around with great velocity and great volume, is how do we try to maintain respect for the traditional notion of sovereignty? At the same time, we build in a sense that sovereignty involves not just rights, but also obligations. That sovereign countries now have to meet certain obligations if they're going to continue to enjoy the rights and the benefits of sovereignty. I actually think that it may not exactly in those words or terms, but I do think that's going to figure prominently in international relations for the rest of this century.
You make an interesting defense of and countercultural defense of nation building in the book, but you also talk about how, as it were, and this was something President Obama talked about a little bit, was nation building begins at home, and I'm going to go slightly off piste here because you wrote an absolutely brilliant essay in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, which I enjoyed very much, and there's this one very, very striking sentence, if I may quote, about America, which says the country is seen not just as less attractive and capable, but also as less reliable as it withdraws from multilateral agreements and distances itself from allies. So the question is, after a summer of riots and the BLM movement and the chaos of the Trump administration's handling of COVID, how does America get its house in order, and get itself back to the levels of respect that it has enjoyed for many decades?
Look, I wish, one, I had the answer to it, and two, I could confidently predict that we would. And I can't sit here and predict clearly that we can. I think, look, one of my previous books, several books ago, was called Foreign Policy Begins at Home. And the whole argument is a country can't be great in the world unless it is strong at home. It needs the resources, it needs the political unity, it needs to attract talent, and it needs to innovate and so forth. And the United States right now has put a lot of that at risk. We're as politically divided as I've ever seen in my lifetime. Our immigration policy is now keeping out so many of the most talented rather than bringing them in. Our public education system in many cases is shambles. No one lines up at a consulate, the US consulate around the world, to go to our inner city public schools. They clearly do it to go to our great universities, but not to our public education. Anyone watching this who's recently landed at Kennedy Airport or Newark Airport knows that our infrastructure is not anywhere near what it could or should be. So I could go on. How we fix this? Is it fixable? Yes. Will we fix it? I don't know, and I worry because our politics in this country have become so unresponsive, particularly at the national level. And I think the bigger hope is probably for more things happening at the state and local level, for more public-private partnerships. But there are certain things only government can do because of the scale. And right now, and I don't like saying this, I don't feel comfortable, but I am more worried about our future. Churchill's famous line that Americans can be counted on to do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else. Well, we're clearly in the everything else phase. And my hunch is we're not done with the everything else phase. And so I'm not sanguine, or as sanguine as I want to be, that we are going to get it right. And so I think this is a tough period for American democracy, for American society, for American economy. And the COVID is a heavy overlay. Tens of millions of unemployed is a heavy overlay. The racial divide is a reality. Watching these two political conventions, these are two very different Americas. And I worry about the ability of the two, not just to coexist, but to come together, to meet national challenges. So I think this is an extraordinarily difficult phase for us. And I'm not going to be glib and say, don't worry. I think one needs to be worried. And if we don't sort it out, it's bad news for the world, because the world needs an active, serious America involved in helping to meet the world's challenges. And if we're divided, if we retreat, the world is not going, I believe, will not succeed in meeting many of the challenges that are going to come at it.
Are you surprised by the extent to which the Republican Party, which, you know, throughout 2016 during the primaries was still quite restive about Trump, has become almost a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump family within less than 4 years? And it's an extraordinary spectacle to see the GOP, you know, this amazing institution full of traditions and institutions and honorable history, just being there on a digital stage without even having a platform.
Quite extraordinary, the decision not to have a platform and simply to announce that they were going to support America First. The number of family members speaking at the Republican convention is quite extraordinary. Indeed, that's, pardon me?
Positively behalf.
What's surprising to me as someone who watches American politics is not that a figure like Donald Trump has emerged. The founders actually anticipated that. And to take a step back in my own life, my first summer in Washington was 1974, which was the summer of Watergate. I had actually just finished my first year at Oxford and came back to work in the Congress for the summer. And what was striking was not that Richard Nixon did what he did, but that so many Republicans in the Senate stood up to push back against him. And what's so striking now is there aren't those Republicans. That it's that rather than being an independent check and balance on this presidency, essentially so many people have become full will and willing participants, enablers, if you wish. And that's something that the founders of the American political experiment, I think, didn't anticipate. They thought that they had built checks and balances into the system. They also felt one other thing, which is that there would be certain norms that would be observed by people with great power, that people would respect certain things. And I think what we've seen is right now is we have a president and an administration that essentially are not great observers of norms. So that which is not explicitly prohibited, in many cases is now done. And that's, again, something that the founders of the American system didn't anticipate. They thought there would be a degree of restraint, of self-monitoring, of holding back for the good of the collective. And so I actually think we're being tested. We're being tested in ways that we haven't been, I don't know if ever, but certainly not in my lifetime.
Richard, there's some terrific questions from the attendees, which I'd like to lob one or two of them your way. Just to paraphrase a long, very interesting question by, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Gregory Kosteriski. He asks, looking at American exceptionalism, what is it now in 2020? What's its foundation, and where does it lead?
That's a really interesting question. So I'm gonna pause for a second and
please do.
Look, I think American exceptionalism has always been, to me, based upon the idea of possibility. And it sounds a little bit cliched, and I apologize, but the idea of the American dream of opportunity, that birth and wealth, where you came from, what color your skin was, what gender you were, that individuals, there was something about this society that allowed individuals to advance, to excel, regardless of any of those things they were born into or were born without. And that, to me, is what made this country so extraordinary. And I think the question going forward is that still true? And to the extent I even have to ask the question, that's unhelpful or in itself somewhat damning. And then I think it leads to a much longer, serious conversation about what is it we would have to do to, how would I put it, make the American dream still an American reality. So it's not just a myth that we tell ourselves, but it's actually a reality for many Americans. And I think there are things that could and should be done with immigration, with the quality of public education, with taxation. There's ways we have to create build more ladders, build more level the playing field in certain ways. But right now, at least, American exceptionalism is not as obvious. I mean, when we've made mistakes in the past, we've been able to self-correct. Watergate, I already mentioned, was one example. The civil rights movement was another. I think one of the questions are, do we have the same capacity for self-correction than we used to? And I don't know. We're going to find out over the next couple of months and possibly the next couple of years. I don't want us to become, quote unquote, just like everybody else. I want it still to be a country of laws, of opportunity, and also norms. And I think again, at the risk of being melodramatic, I do think we are testing ourselves.
Were you surprised by the speed and at least initial unanimity with which the protests over George Floyd's murder in May were globalized? That something that was a highly started off in Minneapolis, became an American issue, and then became a worldwide movement.
Yeah, I was surprised first to the extent they were nationalized in this country, and by that I mean spread so quickly throughout the society, and then internationally. And I've been part of many conversations about why just that. What was that the case? Was it something about the time that elapsed, the graphicness of the knee on the neck, that it was something that anybody could see, anybody could understand, anybody could relate and react to? So I think it had an impact there. I do think the race conversation, I can't speak internationally, but in this country, in the United States, is different than it was. But the actual implementation of change, we're not there yet. And the question is, how do we avoid what I think are the quote unquote, the wrong remedies? And the answer is not defunding police. That's a ridiculous idea. The question is, and as we've seen in the last 48 hours, how do we improve police performance? How do we limit or hopefully avoid altogether abuse of, when police are using firearms in totally inappropriate ways? So the question is, how do we get this right? And how do we avoid, if you will, both underreach and overreach and fixing the very real race problems in this country? And I would simply say the conversation has been teed up, but the reform phase has yet to happen.
A very interesting question from Mehdi Askarieh, who says, before his inauguration, President-elect Trump reportedly asked you to become his Secretary of State, and reportedly you declined. First of all, is that so? And if so, would you explain why you said no? Are you presently disposed to say no?
It didn't quite get that far. He and I, we knew each other from New York. I met with him during the campaign to brief him about international relations, about foreign policy. After he won, I got inquiries about whether I would be prepared to serve. And I basically explained to people that I thought our differences were too profound to make that viable. It wouldn't be good for the country or the president or me for me to join the administration in a senior capacity and to be so at odds with the president that I couldn't stay in the job. And I thought the only real question was whether I would be fired before I resigned. And I don't think that's the way you can enter a job, any senior job in any administration. So look, and it was hard for me to come to that conclusion. I've been lucky enough. I've worked for 4 presidents, Democrats and Republicans alike, and public service at its best. I know this sounds corny, but I don't mean it to be. Is fantastic. I was just at the funeral of Brent Scowcroft a few days ago, who was one of the great public servants of this or any generation. And it really is it's a high calling when the best people are brought in to work together. You really can make a difference. So it was very hard for me to not to go in, but I also have learned that you shouldn't at a certain level, you can only do it. Not that you agree 100% of the time, but you've got to agree on the big things, and you've got to agree on enough so you can go out and represent the policy in good faith. And my last tour in government was rather difficult because I disagreed over the Iraq War. And one of the pledges I made to myself after that is if I ever got the chance to go back in, I would only do it if I thought it was in an administration where I was largely on the same page. And it was pretty clear to me that I would not be on the same page of this administration.
Well, it's impertinent to me to say so, but I think you'd be a fantastic Secretary of State, but you're probably wise to sit this one out. Ralph Simon asks an interesting question. Looking at the Navalny poisoning, would you say that there are aspects of Russia's behavior that make it now worthy of being called an outlaw state?
Look, there's all sorts of things that Russia is doing that are contrary to law. Killing journalists, poisoning opposition leaders, doing what it's doing in Ukraine, doing what it's doing in Georgia, its use of force in a really wanton and indiscriminate way in Syria. So that's a reality. You know, how we actually talk about it, to me, I'd have to be persuaded that if we were to use certain language, that it would have a productive or constructive result. The real question is we need a serious policy towards Russia. And I think, you know, Europeans have been much more correct than ourselves in terms of the criticism of what's recently done with Mr. Navalny. And again, almost what I said before about China, my goal is not to treat Russia like a pariah. I still think, for example, it's in the interest of everyone that the United States and Russia extend this February the due to expire strategic nuclear arms agreement, the so-called New START agreement. So I think things like that make sense. We still need Russia to be part of the conversation about Afghanistan or about North Korea, Iran, not because we like them or agree with them, but because they simply have the capacity to make bad situations worse. But more often than not now, yes, we have got to be prepared to push back against Mr. Putin. He's a serial spoiler. He gets up every morning, and I think he sees the world that he's now working in as one that's largely antithetical to Russian interests and his own personal interests as he perceives them. And I think that, again, the United States and Europe in particular need to come together to push back against him.
Very interesting question from Mary. I'd love to hear from Richard if there's a particular development in foreign policy that he's watching closely and which is making him feel hopeful.
It's good you're sitting down now, Matt. The answer is yes. And it's in all places in Europe. When I wrote the book, the chapters about Europe were quite downbeat. It was in the wake of Brexit, all sorts of other problems in Europe. And I was actually worried for the European project. And I think what we've seen in the last few months has been a real revival of the European project. And I think Franco-German collaboration is alive and well. The performance of several European governments has been quite impressive at dealing with the virus. Democracies have shown they can perform. European financial institutions have stepped up to the challenge, the European Central Bank and the European Commission. So all in all, I actually think Europe today is structurally stronger than it was a year ago. So that's something I feel very good about, and I'm glad to say, in that sense, I was wrong. I turned out I was too pessimistic about Europe's prospects, so I'm thrilled to be wrong on this one.
It's a good one to be wrong on. An anonymous attendee asks a very specific question. What do you make of the preparations Trump appears to be making to delegitimize an unfavorable election outcome? In other words, if he loses, he ain't going anywhere, quietly. Should we be worried?
The short answer is yes. Look, I have no idea what the election outcome is going to be. You know, the old saying, a week is a lifetime in politics. Well, 10 weeks or whatever it is now, 9 weeks is several lifetimes. I don't know what's going to happen, but I worry about what would or could happen if it's a close outcome, if Mr. Biden were to win a close election. And some of that is simply because of the heavy use of these so-called absentee or mail ballots. It's going to be a very slow counting. So we're going to have to stop thinking about election night. It might be election month. And the question then is what happened? There's going to be a lot of disputed. Every time you have paper ballots, there's, as we saw in Florida in the Gore versus Bush race, there's always disputed ballots about what was the voter's intent. Was it handled properly? Was it sent in time? Was it received in time? So at a minimum, this is going to be fought in the courts. I don't rule out, and again, I don't mean to sound melodramatic, I could imagine some of it being fought out in the streets. I also think that if it is a close outcome, the divisions in this country will persist. I mean, ideally, what you want to have is the equivalent of a sporting event, Oxford, Cambridge, hard-fought game. Afterwards, everybody shakes hands and comes together. I don't think that's going to happen. I think, as these two conventions suggest, these are two large camps of Americans, and I worry about the ability of the country to govern and to work together in the country's aftermath. I think a one-sided Biden victory would probably avoid a lot of this if it were sufficiently one-sided. But then again, you'd have the problems of governing afterwards, and a lot might depend upon what happened in the Senate and so forth. But a close election, I think, could add to the difficulties this country faces, because both sides would be tempted to claim foul. If Democrats lose a close election, I think there will be those who'll say this is only because of voter suppression. People not able to get to the polls, people whose ballots weren't counted. And Mr. Trump is already, shall we say, laying the predicate of a challenge to the legitimacy of the elections, and a lot of his followers then wouldn't be prepared to accept the results. And this is very different than, say, Kennedy Nixon or Bush versus Gore, when the loser understood the need to accept things for the good of the country. I don't think we're at that point right now.
Joan Taylor asks a very interesting question, which raises in turn a huge issue. She says, what norms did the early American founders assume that future leaders would adhere to? And it's interesting, isn't it, that if you go back to the Federalist Papers and so on, the founders were actually very, very anxious about the frangibility of the Constitution. They didn't see it as carved in stone. They were very, very aware that it might prove breakable. So the question is, again, how is the Constitution doing 2020?
What's the Constitution more broadly? If you take one example, the pardon power. The president was given enormous pardon power. It was not to be used for cases that he might be involved with. So when the president used the pardon power to pardon Roger Stone, well, I don't think that was what the founders had had in mind. Call me madcap, but I don't think that is what they intended. Or Congress, for example, has granted all sorts of authorities to the President of the United States, and basically says, you have the authority to use this or that sanction or tariff, whatever, for purposes of national security. Well, what the president has done is use them for purposes that were never intended. So these grants of authority have been run with, to put it gently, in ways that, again, weren't intended. Here we are, the Secretary of State, Norm, is speaking tonight from Jerusalem at the Republican Convention. Not the sort of thing that was has been done before, as best I understand that. You already alluded to the lack of a platform. What the message I take from this is, any constitution can only anticipate so much. We've had more than 24 amendments to it. They're living documents. But even with that, they can only anticipate so many particulars, and there's always a gray area that governance takes place in within any society. A little bit like an accountant, on your taxes. And you're said, okay, you can do this, this, and that, you can't do that. But no tax law can anticipate every gray area and there's decisions to be made and choices to be made. And I think the same thing applies to governing. And so to me, it's not that the Constitution is to be faulted, because I don't think you can amend your way out of this. I don't think we can always legislate our way out of this. That's where compromise becomes important. That is where respect for norms and limits becomes important. And the founders were very aware that they were creating a republic that was inevitably and unavoidably fragile. And I think that's true of, the old line, it's a democracy if you can keep it. And I think that what we're seeing is some of the tests of a democracy.
Edwina has a very pithy but excellent question, which is, what will heal the divides in America?
Well, it's an interesting question. And embedded in it is a bit of optimism, I suppose, that they are potentially healable. One thing that will not heal them, which a lot of people thought, is crisis. We've had 9/11, we had 2007-8 financial, now we have COVID-19. And what's so interesting to me as an observer is that people always say it'll take a crisis to bring folks together. Well, guess what? We've now had our share of crises, and unless I missed it, it hasn't brought people together. So one could say it could be a leader who's able to appeal across the divide. That's a possibility. Someone who doesn't just lead his base, but tries to bring a larger share and create certain opportunities and build a kind of governing coalition. And think about, if, for example, if a Joe Biden were to win, whether he includes in his administration people who come from various political traditions, rather than this administration, which is largely predicated on a narrow but intense political base. Another possibility is it may take structural change down the road, and that's such things as how we draw our congressional districts, so they're multi-party districts as opposed to done so they're essentially one-party districts. How we change the rules of voting, so you have preferences. So if you don't get it pushes people to occupy middle ground rather than extremes. You can't win with a plurality. You have to be able to put together majorities. Centrist political parties. Imagine a scenario where the Republican Party continues to be a very conservative party, or not conservative, but a kind of populist party of Trump. Democratic Party goes to the other end zone, the other extreme. What might that not open up space in the middle? I don't know. American democracy is dynamic, but in the short run, I don't think you can look to structural change. I think in the short run, you'd have to look for a quality of leadership that tries to build a broader governing coalition.
So just before we started, Richard, we were talking, I was saying that I thought the book is one of those books that is going to have a life and it will endure. And I suppose one of the questions I'd like to ask you as we sort of head towards the end of the hour is in addressing the world now, and specifically, I guess, whoever is inaugurated in January, what are the key post-COVID priorities for a world that is governed by norms, that is multilateral, and that has a prospect of collaborating on the issues you deal with in the book?
I'd say from the point of view of the United States, I'm going to list 4 things, and very quickly, and 2 different kinds of things. One is we've got to repair the home front a little bit. We've got to deal with, we've got to get the virus under control through some mix of behaviors, therapeutic drugs, hopefully vaccines. We've got to deal with some of the economic challenges, some of the race issues. And unless we deal with the home front, we're simply not going to have the bandwidth to take on the world. So that's one thing. Secondly, the United States needs to repair its alliances. We have a great structural advantage. We get up every morning, get out of bed, and we have dozens of natural partners and allies in Europe and in Asia. And that is who we should be working with to deal with everything else. So I would say the repair of our alliances has got to be central. So those are 2 things: address the challenges at home, repair alliances. And then internationally, I'd focus on 2 things. One would be on China. This is the major relationship of this era, to try to calm to some extent the competition so it doesn't spill over into conflict. We push back against China where we must, but we try to protect areas of limited cooperation where we can. Again, this would be done better with allies. And then we've got to begin to make progress on dealing with these global challenges, whether it is climate, whether it's heading off the next pandemic, whether it is cyberspace, what have you. So again, I think, as the prerequisites are strengthening the country and strengthening alliances, and then we can deal with the geopolitical and the global challenges of the era.
It's an excellent way to end. I think we can all agree that it's been an absolutely gripping hour, and I'm hugely grateful to Richard for his time, and to you all for joining us. If you haven't read the book yet, do get it. It's an absolute joy, and it's the kind of thing that I read it and then I found myself dipping into it constantly. It's one of those books that very unusual kind of book that goes from being a standard text to becoming something that you treat as a work of reference. It's really something very special. So thank you very much, Richard, for giving us your time and your wisdom and insights. And thank you to everyone for attending. And I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you.